There is a kind of kitchen this country is forgetting. A small kitchen. A tired kitchen. Worn floors, thin curtains, a stove that worked harder than anyone in the house. Nothing matched, nothing was wasted. And somehow, supper still appeared on the table. That miracle didn't come from money. It came from women who knew things. They knew what to do with one onion, a heel of bread, a handful of beans soaking since sunrise. They turned cheap food into real food, filling food, food that stayed with you. Somewhere along the way, we started calling those meals poor people food, as if feeding 6 people with 3 ingredients was failure, not genius. Our grandmothers knew better. Tonight, we're going back to that world, 25 forgotten dinners built not with abundance, but with instinct, restraint, and love. Stay with me, because by number 1, you'll never look at poor man's food the same way again. Number 25. Salt, pork, and cabbage. Ingredients: cabbage, salt pork. Water German and Czech immigrant families who had settled across the Missouri River Valley brought this meal from the old country and kept it through the Depression because they had no choice and because it worked. A head of cabbage cost 5 cents in 1933. Salt pork cost 5 to 8 cents a pound. You put them in a pot with a little water, covered it, and let the steam do the slow work. The cabbage wilted down to almost nothing, soaking up the fat and smoke from the pork, turning translucent and soft with a faint natural sweetness underneath the salt. The pork crisped at the edges where it touched the bottom of the pot. What results is a dish that modern French bistros call braised cabbage, with lardons and served for $16 a portion. The German grandmothers who developed it called it supper. Number 24. Fried potatoes and onions. Ingredients: potatoes, onions, lard. Potatoes cost 10 cents for 3 pounds in 1933. Onions cost even less. A cast iron skillet, a spoonful of lard, and those 2 vegetables, that was dinner in rural Oklahoma, in Kansas farm kitchens, in the hill country of Tennessee. The technique mattered enormously. You sliced the potatoes thin so they crisped at the edges, added the onions halfway through so they turned soft and sweet without burning. Then covered the skillet for 5 minutes to steam everything through before removing the lid and letting the bottom catch just enough to go golden. This dish works because of the Maillard reaction, the same chemical process that makes bread crust brown and steak develop a sear. When starch meets fat meets high heat, new flavor compounds are created that didn't exist in the raw ingredients. The women who made this dish didn't know the chemistry. They knew the result. And no restaurant in America has ever improved on it. Number 23. Egg gravy over toast. Ingredients: eggs, milk, bread. In the farmhouses of Oklahoma and Kansas, in the years when the Dust Bowl had taken the topsoil and the banks had taken the land, the chickens sometimes kept laying when everything else had stopped. Eggs cost 15 cents a dozen in 1933. You scrambled 2 or 3 into a hot skillet of flour-thickened milk, kept them moving until the mixture tightened into a pale, soft gravy, and poured it over thick toast dried in the oven. Egg gravy works because of protein coagulation. The egg proteins denature in the hot liquid and create a structure that thickens without curdling, producing something with the consistency of a loose bechamel but richer in flavor. It was warm and filling, and it tasted of the fat from the skillet and the faint sweetness of the milk. The children ate it without complaint. The mothers ate whatever was left standing over the sink. Number 22. Hoover stew. Ingredients: potatoes, onions, canned tomatoes. They named it after the president who publicly insisted the suffering wasn't as bad as it looked. In the Hoovervilles, the encampments of cardboard and corrugated tin that appeared on the edges of every major American city between 1930 and 1938, this was the community pot. Potatoes, onions, canned tomatoes, and whatever else could be found or contributed from what neighbors had left. A full pot cost under 15 cents total. The potatoes went in first, cut rough and unpeeled. The onions softened in the heat. The tomatoes broke down and turned the broth a deep, burnished red. It was thin, but it was hot. And hot mattered more than anything else when you were sleeping in a tent in January in Cincinnati or on a church basement cot in Detroit. They ate it with shame. They should have eaten it with pride. Number 21. Chili beans. Ingredients: pinto beans, dried chili peppers, lard in the colonias and barrios of South Texas and the mountain villages of New Mexico. Mexican-American families had been cooking dried pinto beans with lard and dried chili peppers since long before the Depression made economy a necessity. A full pot cost under 12 cents in 1933. The dried chilies went into the hot lard first, blooming in the fat and releasing capsaicin compounds and fat-soluble pigments that created a depth of flavor impossible to achieve any other way. The beans, soaked overnight and cooked until tender, went in with just enough water to keep them loose. The result was thick, rust-red, and fragrant with a heat that built gradually and stayed without burning. Capsaicin, the active compound in chili peppers, has been studied for its anti-inflammatory and metabolic effects. The abuela, who made this in a clay pot over a wood fire in 1935, called it dinner. Today, restaurant menus call it heirloom bean chili and charge $18 a bowl. Number 20. Potato soup. Water-based ingredients: potatoes, water, salt, not cream of potato, not leek and potato, just potatoes, water, and salt. The meal that Irish immigrant families in Boston, New York, and Chicago had carried forward from the hunger memory of the old country and that Depression-era families across the Midwest kept returning to because potatoes cost 3 cents a pound and the soup they made from them lasted 3 days. You boiled the potatoes in salted water until they began to fall apart at the edges. Some you mashed against the side of the pot to thicken the broth. Some you left whole. An onion, if available, a splash of bacon fat floated on top. The result is what nutritionists would now describe as a complete starchy meal. Potatoes contain all essential amino acids, significant vitamin C, and meaningful potassium. In Manhattan restaurants today, Vichyssoise cold potato soup finished with cream runs $16 a cup. Grandma made a pot that lasted the whole week. Number 19. Drippings bread. Ingredients: bread, bacon, drippings, salt. Every piece of bacon that came out of a Depression-era skillet left something behind. That dark, smoky, salty rendered fat was not discarded. It was poured carefully into a tin kept by the stove and saved. In working-class rowhouse kitchens in South Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and the mill towns of the Carolinas, that saved grease went onto bread spread thick like butter, salted lightly, eaten as a meal. It cost nothing because it was made from what would otherwise be thrown away. Here is what the food industry spent decades concealing. In the 1950s, companies marketing hydrogenated vegetable shortening positioned bacon drippings as a backward, unhealthy symbol of poverty. The historical record tells a different story. Rendered lard from pasture-raised pigs contains meaningful amounts of vitamin D and oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fat found in olive oil. The shortening they sold you instead contained hydrogenated trans fats that we now know were actively harmful. The women who kept saving their drippings were right. Number 18. Pinto beans and cornbread. Ingredients: navy beans, salt, pork, water. In the mountains of eastern Kentucky and the Piedmont of North Carolina, this was not a side dish. This was the entire meal. A pound of dried pinto beans cost less than 3 cents in 1933. You soaked them overnight in cold water, put them in a heavy pot with a piece of fatback and a pinch of salt, and let them cook long and low all morning while you did everything else that needed doing. By noon, the beans were silky and thick. The liquid had turned a deep, rich amber. The beans themselves gave just slightly when pressed against the roof of your mouth. The cornbread went into a cast-iron skillet cornmeal, water, a little lard, and came out crackling at the edges and pale gold at the center. Nutritionally, a cup of cooked pinto beans delivers roughly 15 grams of protein, nearly half a day's recommended fiber, and significant amounts of folate, iron, and manganese. This was not empty food. This was a carefully constructed, nutritionally complete meal that fed a family of 5 for 2 full days at a total cost of under a nickel. Grandma just called it soup beans. She was right about everything. Number 17. Sweet potato and butter. Ingredients: sweet potatoes, butter, salt. Sweet potatoes cost 10 cents for 3 pounds in the early 1930s. In the rural South, particularly in the black farming communities of Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, they went into the oven whole in their skins and baked slowly until the natural sugars caramelized inside and the flesh turned deep orange. A small piece of butter pressed into the split center, melted, and pooled into every crack. That was dinner. 3 ingredients, 1 oven, 1 hour. A single medium sweet potato contains more beta-carotene than the modern recommended daily allowance, along with significant potassium, vitamin C, and a family of antioxidant compounds that nutrition researchers are still actively studying. The women who grew them in backyard gardens and put them in the oven every Thursday evening understood something profound about feeding a body efficiently on very little money. Number 16. Fried cornmeal mush. Ingredients: cornmeal, water, bacon fat. 5 pounds of cornmeal cost 10 cents in 1932. You boiled it slow in salted water until it thickened into something you could stand a spoon in. Then you poured it into a loaf pan, let it cool completely overnight, and the next day sliced it thick and fried the slices in a skillet of hot bacon fat until a golden crust formed on both sides, crackling outside, soft and steaming within. In the Midwest and across the Appalachian coalfields, this was served as dinner as often as breakfast. It delivered slow-burning carbohydrate energy that sustained 10-hour shifts underground or 8-hour days in frozen fields. Today, Italian restaurants slice the same preparation thin drizzled truffle oil over it and call it polenta. They charge $18 a plate. The women of eastern Ohio did it better with a dime's worth of cornmeal and a skillet they'd been using for 30 years. Number 15. Cracklin' bread. Ingredients: cornmeal, cracklings, salt. When farm families in Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi rendered pork fat, boiling it down to make lard, what remained at the bottom of the kettle were the cracklings. Crisp, dark, salty scraps of rendered pork skin and fat. They cost nothing because they were what remained after everything useful had already been extracted. You folded them into cornmeal batter with water and a little salt, poured it into a cast-iron skillet, and baked it. The fat from the cracklings melted back into the bread as it cooked, crisping the bottom, flavoring the crumb, and filling the kitchen with a smell that has no modern equivalent. The result was what food scientists would now describe as umami-rich, the glutamates from the rendered pork skin, creating a depth of flavor that simply couldn't be achieved with any substitution. Nothing wasted. Not 1 gram. That was not poverty cooking. That was applied genius. Number 14. Tomato gravy over biscuits. Ingredients: canned tomatoes, lard, flour. A can of tomatoes cost 10 cents in the early 1930s. 2 tablespoons of lard, 2 tablespoons of flour. That was tomato gravy. In the sharecropper cabins of Georgia and the tenant farms of the Texas Hill Country, it went over biscuits for dinner 3 nights a week when there was no meat and no money coming until Friday. The process is a classic roux. You brown the flour in hot lard until it turns the color of a copper penny, developing nutty, complex flavors as the starch proteins break down in the fat. Then the crushed tomatoes go in, the liquid seizes and sputters, and then smooths into something brick red and deeply savory. Poured over a split biscuit, it is acidic, rich, and filling in a way that keeps surprising you. Today we call it marinara bruschetta and charge $14 an order. Grandma called it Tuesday. Number 13. Rice and tomatoes. Ingredients: white rice, canned tomatoes, salt. Along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana and Mississippi, Cajun and black Southern families had been stretching rice for generations before the Depression arrived and made stretching a matter of survival. Long grain white rice cost 14 cents for 2 pounds. A can of whole tomatoes, salt. The tomatoes went over the cooked rice, hot and acidic, breaking apart as they hit the starch, the whole dish coming together into something that was genuinely more than the sum of its parts. It fed a family of 6 for under 20 cents. It reheated even better the next day, the rice having absorbed the tomato liquid overnight until it was dense and almost sticky. The acidity of the tomatoes also served a nutritional function. The vitamin C in the tomato liquid significantly increases the bioavailability of the non-heme iron in the rice. The grandmothers who made this dish had no word for bioavailability. They knew the result. Number 12. Lard biscuits. Ingredients: flour, lard, baking powder. Lard cost 8 cents a pound in 1933. Flour cost pennies. A little baking powder and salt completed the recipe. In every Southern kitchen, every Appalachian farmhouse, and every Midwestern prairie home, biscuits made with lard were the bread of the table served with dinner, eaten plain, used to sop up whatever remained in the pot. The lard went into the flour cold, broken apart with the fingertips until it formed pea-sized crumbles, and the resulting biscuit had a flake and a tenderness that butter biscuits have never quite matched. The reason is pure food science. Lard is nearly 100% fat with very little water content, while butter is roughly 80% fat and 20% water. In biscuit making, water creates steam during baking, which develops gluten and toughens the crumb. Lard's low water content produces a shorter, more tender crumb with significantly more flake. The women who made these biscuits didn't know the food science. They knew the biscuit. Number 11. Milk toast. Ingredients: bread, milk, butter. In the tenement kitchens of immigrant families, Polish, Italian, and Jewish families crowded into the cold water flats of Chicago's South Side and Boston's North End, milk toast was what you made when there was truly nothing left. Bread toasted until stiff. Hot milk poured over it. A little butter if you had it, salt if you didn't. A loaf of bread cost 12 cents in 1933. 3 cans of evaporated milk cost 16 cents combined. Those 2 ingredients got a careful family through a week of dinners. The toast softened slowly in the hot milk, becoming something between a soup and a porridge, warm, simple, and sustaining in a way that had nothing to do with sophistication and everything to do with love. Mothers made this when they had nothing else. Their children remembered it for the rest of their lives. Number 10. Mulligan stew. Ingredients: potatoes, beans, whatever could be found. In the hobo jungles strung along the railroad lines, the informal camps where transient workers gathered in the years between 1930 and 1939, men who had lost jobs and farms and families and were riding freight trains across the country, Mulligan stew was the community meal. Every man who came to the fire contributed something: a potato, a handful of dried beans, a heel of bread, a dented, unlabeled can found behind a grocery store. It went into the pot together. The stew that came out was different every time and the same every time: hot, filling, and made through collective effort from collective need. Food historians have documented this meal across dozens of hobo camp accounts from the 1930s, and the consistency of the practice speaks to something important about human cooperation under stress. When people had nothing individually, they built something communally. This was not desperation. This was community engineering. Number 9. Cornbread in buttermilk. Ingredients: cornbread, buttermilk, salt. In the mountain counties of eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, before television and the supermarket arrived, the evening meal was sometimes nothing more than this: Yesterday's cornbread, broken into a glass of cold buttermilk, eaten with a spoon. The cornbread absorbed the liquid slowly, softening from the outside in, staying slightly grainy at the center. The buttermilk was cold and sharp and faintly sour against the neutral corn. Buttermilk in the 1930s was the liquid left behind after churning cream into butter, a byproduct that cost almost nothing. It was also rich in live lactic acid bacteria, the same probiotic cultures that modern supplements try to deliver. Fermented dairy products have been associated in numerous studies with improved gut microbiome diversity and reduced inflammatory markers. The grandmothers who drank buttermilk every evening and lived into their 90s were not lucky. They were right. Number 8. Navy bean soup with salt pork. Ingredients: navy beans, salt pork, water. 10 pounds of navy beans cost 24 cents in 1933. A piece of salt pork added only a few cents more. Water completed the recipe. In New England fishing villages and rural Indiana farm kitchens, these three things went into a pot together and cooked for hours until the beans had collapsed into a thick, ivory-colored broth that clung to the back of a spoon. The salt pork gave up all of its fat, smoke, and deep mineral salinity into the liquid over those slow hours. A single pot fed a family of 6 for 2 full days. Nutritionally, 1 cup of navy bean soup delivers more than 15 grams of protein and nearly half a day's fiber requirement, making it one of the most cost-efficient nutrition delivery systems ever developed in an American kitchen. Number 7. Dandelion greens with vinegar and bacon fat. Ingredients: dandelion greens, apple cider vinegar, bacon fat. Every yard in America grew them for free. In the Italian immigrant neighborhoods of western Pennsylvania and across the rural Midwest, women went out in early spring with a knife and a basket and came back with enough dandelion greens to fill a pot. You wilted them in bacon fat in a hot skillet, hit them with a splash of apple cider vinegar at the end, and ate them while they were still steaming. The vinegar cut the bitterness of the greens through a straightforward acid-base interaction with the alkaloid compounds responsible for that bitterness. The fat carried and distributed the fat-soluble vitamins present in the leaves. The nutritional profile of a dandelion green rivals spinach in iron content and exceeds it in vitamin C. They grew in every vacant lot and untended field during the Depression, and the women who knew how to cook them were delivering vitamins and minerals to their families that no government relief package could provide. They called it weeds. It was medicine. Number 6. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Ingredients: dried beef, milk, flour. In working-class boarding houses in the industrial cities of the Northeast Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Buffalo, where steel workers and railroad men rented rooms and ate communal suppers, creamed, chipped beef on toast appeared on the table with dependable regularity throughout the 1930s and into the war years. Dried beef, shaved paper thin, a white sauce made from flour and milk, toast. The white sauce is a classic bechamel flour cooked briefly in fat to eliminate raw starch taste, milk whisked in until the amylase in the flour has fully gelatinized the starch, the dried beef folded in and warmed through. It was pale, savory, and faintly salty from the preserved meat, and it stuck to your ribs in the way that only starch-thickened protein over bread can do. The soldiers who ate it in military mess halls during World War II gave it a different, unprintable name. The grandmothers who made it at home called it a good hot dinner. Number 5. Skillet cornbread and pot liquor. Ingredients: cornbread, collard greens, liquor, fatback. The pot was never empty. Collard greens had cooked down in it all morning with a piece of fatback and black pepper, and what remained in the bottom was not simply broth. It was something darker and silkier than broth, the color of strong tea, glossy with dissolved fat and minerals, and everything the greens had surrendered during their long, slow cooking. Nutritionists at Tuskegee University documented what the grandmothers already understood. Every vitamin and mineral the collards released during cooking ended up in that liquid. Iron, calcium, folate, all of it. You crumbled yesterday's cornbread into a bowl and ladled the pot liquor over it. The cornbread softened slowly from the bottom up, soaking up the dark, smoky liquid. Grandma called it not wasting good food. She was right. That was not waste avoidance. That was nutritional optimization, practiced generations before the phrase existed. Number 4. Fried salt pork with boiled potatoes. Ingredients: salt pork, potatoes, salt. In the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas and Missouri, where cash money was almost entirely absent through most of the 1930s and into the 1940s, salt pork was the meat. It cost 5 to 8 cents a pound and kept without refrigeration. You sliced it thick and laid it in a dry skillet over medium heat, letting its own fat render out slowly, the slices curling at the edges, crisping until brown and dense with flavor. Potatoes boiled in their skins in salted water on the back burner simultaneously. The science here is straightforward and elegant. Rendering fat from salt pork is simply controlled fat extraction. As the internal temperature of the meat rises above the melting point of its fat, that fat liquefies and pools in the skillet, simultaneously becoming the cooking medium. The potatoes, boiled in their skins, retain more of their vitamin C and potassium than peeled potatoes boiled in unsalted water. Everything worked. Nothing was wasted. The Ozarks called it supper. Number 3. Spaghetti with lard and garlic. Ingredients: spaghetti, lard, garlic. In the Italian immigrant neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, East Harlem, and the mill towns of western Pennsylvania, this was the weeknight meal that kept families fed through the worst years of the Depression. Pasta cost 10 cents a pound in 1933. Garlic was grown in every backyard. Lard was in every kitchen. You cooked the spaghetti in heavily salted boiling water, reserved a cup of that starchy water before draining, and tossed the hot pasta in a skillet where garlic had been slowly warming in lard until soft and gold and fragrant. The reserved pasta water is the key, and this technique is now taught in culinary schools as a fundamental principle of Italian cooking. The starch released by the pasta into that water acts as an emulsifier, binding the water and the fat into a glossy, cohesive sauce that clings to every strand. The Nanas of South Philadelphia understood emulsification without knowing the word. In Italian restaurants today, the same dish, aglio e olio, runs $22 a plate. They called it dinner. They were right. 2. Rice and flour gravy. Ingredients: white rice, flour, lard. In the parishes of South Louisiana and the black farming communities of the Mississippi Delta, flour gravy over white rice was not a side dish. It was the meal. White rice cost 7 cents a pound in the 1930s. A tablespoon of lard, 2 tablespoons of flour, whatever thin broth or water remained from anything else cooked that week. You browned the flour in the hot fat until it turned the color of a brown paper bag, that slow, careful darkening that Cajun cooks called the roux. The roux is the foundation of Cajun cooking and one of the most sophisticated flavor development techniques in world cuisine. As the flour browns in the fat, the Maillard reaction produces hundreds of new flavor compounds, the same process that browns meat and toasts bread, but applied to pure starch. The result is a sauce with extraordinary depth that its 3 simple ingredients have no right to suggest. Poured over white rice, it fed 6 people twice for under 15 cents total. Number 1. The onion sandwich. Ingredients: bread, raw onion, lard, or butter. In the coal mining towns of western Pennsylvania and the mill towns along the Monongahela River, in the immigrant households where Polish, Slovak, and Italian families worked 12-hour shifts for wages that barely covered the rent. The onion sandwich was the meal that nobody talked about. Sliced raw onion on bread. Lard or butter spread thin. Salt. That was it. That was dinner on the worst nights. The onion was sharp and cold against the soft bread, the fat muting the bite just enough, the salt pulling everything together into something that was more than it had any right to be. It cost 3 cents. Maybe 2. The people who ate it were ashamed of it. They never should have been. Raw onions are among the most nutritionally dense allium vegetables available, rich in quercetin, a flavonoid with well-documented anti-inflammatory properties, and containing prebiotic fructooligosaccharides that feed beneficial gut bacteria. That sandwich kept children alive. It kept men strong enough to go back into the mine the next morning. It kept women standing long enough to cook something better when something better was possible. Here is what the food industry did not want you to understand. They needed you to be ashamed of the onion sandwich. They needed you to believe that the only dignified meal came in a box with a brand name on it. The moment you accepted that, they had something precious, your grandmother's knowledge, her 3-ingredient genius, her understanding of how fat and starch and acid and heat and time could feed a family on almost nothing. And they have been selling that knowledge back to you in pieces ever since. At $14 a plate and $18 a bowl and $22 an entree, stripped of the history and the human dignity that made it sacred in the first place.